Welcome to this first lecture in the series where we'll be talking about global value chains and trade in value added. This lecture is really about setting the scene for the rest of the course. So what I want you to think about while we're going through it is sort of what a value chain is and what difference it makes to the way in which we think about the world economy, and in particular, the way in which we think about development policy within the current world economy. So to give us a bit of a guide as to what I think the key points are, because we'll be covering an awful lot of territory in this lecture, I've put up some key points that I'd really like you to keep in mind if you can as we go through this material. So the first one, when we talk about trade in regional value chains, RVCs, and global value chains, GVCs, what we're talking about is a geographical unbundling of production. And there are two types of unbundling that we talk about. The first unbundling is a separation of producers and consumers. This is the standard framework that we have in mind from when we learned trade in university. But there's another unbundling, and this is what really comes to the fore with value chains, and that is the unbundling of the production process itself. So different parts of the production process being located in different countries. Now, the result of this, and what we can observe and what we can see, is intensive trade in intermediates. That is to say, goods and services that are used in the production of other goods and services. So when we've got a world economy that's characterized by that sort of activity, this brings us to the second point, that regional and global value chains offer indeed a new development model. And we can contrast here the experience of two very successful countries, admittedly at different stages, but we can look at the South Korean model, which involved very much a focus on constructing whole supply chains. So there would be a lead firm, and then there would be a universe of input suppliers, and the whole thing would be focused on export markets, and that was their outward-oriented development model. Contrast that with the model of a country like Vietnam, where they're not developing the full supply chain. They're focusing on joining a value chain at a particular point and then gradually moving up over time towards higher value-added activities. So given that this is the type of economy that we're in, we need to be careful when we look at gross value trade data. Now, when I say gross value trade data, I mean the usual trade data that we're used to dealing with. So they come from Comtrade, they come from customs, or all the usual entities. So when we have this intensive trade in intermediate goods and services, I'll show you that gross value trade data suddenly start to provide a much less complete picture of the economic nature of the transactions that are going into creating this trade. So that has created a rationale for looking at trade in value added, which is the core of what we want to walk away with from this lecture. And the essence of trade in value added is to track the origin of value added in a country's exports by origin, country, and sector. And I'll talk to you about exactly what that means using both a very concrete example of a particular good and a more abstract example of what that looks like at a sectoral level. Now, when we come to think about the data for this, obviously we'll get into the technicalities of it in lecture 2, but we can think about it intuitively even at this early stage. We can see that what we're going to need is some sort of input-output framework, so some data source that tells us how one sector uses another sector's output to produce its own output. So that's what we need on the one hand, and then we need to combine that somehow with trade data. And so what I'm going to suggest, last part, is that the magic of trade in value added, and it's all powered by what I'm calling a MRIO, an MRIO, multi-region input-output table. I personally believe that the real magic is in the data work that is required to assemble these tables. We'll see that the analytical work, there's a simple version that is really quite straightforward to understand. There's a more complex version where the intuition is straightforward, the math gets a lot more complicated. But it's very much a process where data quality and completeness determine the usefulness of those outputs that we produce from a policy perspective. And of course, that's what we're interested in. So in this lecture, we're going to be taking a very broad brush approach to some big questions around value chains and global trade. Then we're going to get more technical in lecture 2. And in lecture 3, we'll look at a practical example to see how to make all of this policy relevant. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about in this lecture is really just 3 things. One is the value chain development model. So thinking about what a value chain is and why it matters for the way in which we think about development. I'll then go into the rationale for measuring trade and value added, give you a few examples of why I think it's important, and then we'll start talking about the data requirements that we'll go into in a lot more depth when we do the technical material in lecture 2. So the value chain development model. I like to start this story with South Korea. The reason that I start with South Korea is that it's really the most recent example of a country that has fully transitioned from middle income to high income status. Of course, there are numerous other examples when we think of the Asian tigers and what used to be called the newly industrializing or newly industrialized economies. But Korea is a nice case because this transition was completed relatively recently. And of course, I'm putting out of consideration here special cases like oil-rich countries. So before we move to the value chain development model, let's think about what Korea did as part of its development strategy. Now, what I'm going to say is extremely stylized. There's a big literature on Korea's development policy. We can get into a lot of detail about it, but I'm actually not interested in that for present purposes. I want to think about it in a very, very stylized way. For those of you with a modeling background, you can almost think of taking these sort of stylized relationships and turning them into a quantitative model. So what I'm going to suggest is that Korea's model was very much an outward-oriented growth model in the sense that industries were oriented towards world markets. The primary aim of developing industries was not to serve the domestic market, it was to serve the world market. So there was this discipline that came from competing in the world market. But at the same time, there was support for the development of industries. And again, there's a whole literature on industrial policy in Korea through the 80s and 90s. But the focus for our purposes is really important. The idea was to develop a local supply chain. That is to say, if we think of a car manufacturer like Hyundai, their objective was to serve the world market, okay? So they always wanted to export. But at the same time as there was support for this lead firm in its growth and development, there was also the idea that it would in turn support a kind of a universe of input suppliers within Korea itself. That is to say, businesses that are supplying parts and components that then go into the final cars that are exported. So it's really a case of sort of developing this full supply chain. Of course, it was never 100%. There was always use of imported intermediates, but the emphasis was on developing both the lead firms and input suppliers. Now we can look here at some familiar cases. So I've put Korea on a figure with Singapore and Hong Kong, China. So these are 3 of the industrialized economies of East and Southeast Asia. You can see on the left-hand graph the trade to GDP ratio. So this is simply taking exports plus imports and dividing by GDP. You can see that it's very high. So for small economies like Hong Kong, China, and Singapore, the trade to GDP ratio is in excess of 100%, in fact, well over 100%. But even for a mid-sized economy like Korea, there are years in which the trade to GDP ratio is over 100%. So we're seeing a lot of exports and imports going on relative to the size of the economy. And then the right-hand graph is simply putting this in the perspective of those countries' development trajectories. If we look at real GDP per capita, and this is adjusted for inflation and price differences across countries, you get basically the same story if you do it with other types of data. But you can see this very rapid and sustained growth in per capita incomes in the 3 countries. So this is really kind of the classic outward-oriented development strategy. That is to say, countries engaging in a lot of international trade, that is to say both exports and imports, and then through that, plus a whole host of other factors, seeing this rapid growth in real GDP per capita. I don't want to oversimplify here, so there's a lot that goes into these models other than trade. But of course, we're here to talk about trade, so I do want to focus in just on that part of the relationship. So trade policy was a big part of the development strategy in these countries. Now, Singapore and Hong Kong, China, of course, have unusual trade policies. They are unilateral free traders, so they basically have zero tariffs on all goods that are coming into the country, a few small exceptions. Korea is in a different case. What we see in Korea's case is tariffs that are actually still moderately high by the standards of industrialized countries, relatively low in historical context, but we do see a progressive liberalization over time. We can see that in the figure here. So we've got the two lines down the bottom for the free traders at zero, and you can see Korea's average tariff on manufacturers going down sharply in the 1980s and then more gradually during the 1990s and 2000s. So you can see there this progressive engagement with the world economy. I dislike the term export-led growth. I really think outward-oriented is a better way of summarizing the strategy because, you know, yes, there was a lot of attention given to exports and the discipline that comes from exporting to the world market and competing there. But there was also a lot of attention given to the import side of the equation. And we see this in the trade to GDP figures. We see it in trade policy. Okay, so that's a kind of a bird's eye, very simple view of the recent historical experience. What about the current landscape? Now, what I've done here is pick out a few countries in Asia that are experiencing and have been experiencing for some time rapid growth. Now, I should say, when I talk about that rapid growth, I'm talking pre-pandemic. Okay, so the pandemic has hit all of us. It's a global economic phenomenon. These countries have had different experiences, but obviously that's a shock. It's a completely exogenous shock to the system. So what I'm interested in is really the growth trajectory before sort of the first and second quarters of this year. So if we think of these countries, the ones that stand out to me are India, Bangladesh, China, and Vietnam. Now, what can we say about the development strategies that are going on in those countries? Now, I think we need to put India in a bit of a category of its own. India has always had relatively high tariffs. It continues to do so. And because it is a very populous country, there has always been a significant focus on the domestic market. So firms primarily serving the domestic market. That may be changing. There was, of course, the Make in India policy. I don't want to get into how successful or not that policy has been, but at least the language started to change in the early parts of the current government to talk about India becoming a production platform for the global market in the way that we see in some of these other economies. So let's put India to one side for a second. But the other ones, Bangladesh, China, and Vietnam, we can see a much stronger outward orientation. So the focus on the world market is still there, but the point of emphasis is a bit different. So, you know, there is this similarity with the experience of the Asian tigers in terms of the outward orientation, but there are notable differences, and I'd like to go into some of those in a little more detail. Now, the reason why these differences exist is that the world has undergone a pretty fundamental change in the intervening time. Now, I like to follow Richard Baldwin's way of thinking about this, which is to talk about the unbundlings. So the first unbundling, he sees as happening from maybe the 1820s through to the 1980s. It's driven by technological change, in this case, falling transport costs. And those falling transport costs made it possible to unbundle production and consumption, by which he means to geographically separate production and consumption. This is the classic trade model that we have in mind when we take trade as undergraduates or even in many graduate programs. It's the classic sort of Heckscher-Ohlin endowment-based trade model with a lot of trade in final goods. So when we think of the examples that we were taught in universities, often things like cars, computers, these sorts of things. So the emphasis was on these final goods for consumption. Now, from the 1990s onwards, there's been a major change. It's technological again, but with the rise of information and communication technologies, it makes it possible now to geographically separate the production process itself. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think of producing something like an iPhone, and we'll talk in more detail in a second, it's an immensely complex production undertaking. There are hundreds, thousands of different steps that take place during that process. And what Richard's saying with the second unbundling is that you can actually locate different parts of that process in different places and then bring them together, assemble the final good and ship it off. Okay, so that's the change that's taken place in the world economy. And to me, in again, a very simple way of thinking about it is that there are two different development models that go with that. Korea's model is one that's very much based on the first unbundling. So it's the development of national supply chains to serve the global market, taking advantage of all the demand that is coming from overseas, as well as the competitive pressure that is coming from the world market. In the second unbundling, let's think about a country like Vietnam. Their development model, rather than building full domestic supply chains, seems to be based much more on joining regional value chains and global value chains. So there are some similarities in terms of the outward orientation, but there are also some important differences of emphasis that I think we need to keep in mind. Let's talk about those differences. We're all used to talking about comparative advantage. You know, it's the key sort of concept that trade theory teaches us. But the way in which we define comparative advantage is actually quite different in the two models. It tends to be quite a broad definition when we think of the kind of Korea model. And this is the type of comparative advantage that you've probably talked about in university courses, where we talk about a country having a comparative advantage in wheat or in manufactured goods, in high technology sectors, these sorts of things. That's very much sort of a sectoral definition. The new approach to comparative advantage is much more narrowly defined in terms of the specialization. It's really talking about tasks. That is to say, particular parts of the production process that a country can be relatively good at and therefore can productively specialize in. The second thing that we see that's very different is much more intensive trade in intermediate goods. And we see them actually crossing borders multiple times during the production process. This is both goods and services. So that immediately says the countries that have low trade costs have an advantage in terms of attracting investment. That is to say, getting a lead firm in a value chain to come and put in place a production plant to invest, to do some FDI, build a production plant in a country where it might be taking components from all over the region or all over the world, and then assembling them into a final product and shipping it off. We've seen China be very successful with that sort of process. We're increasingly seeing it in Vietnam. And incidentally, since I gave Korea as an example, Korea's position in all of this has now changed very fundamentally. We see businesses like Samsung, they've built a huge plant in Vietnam for assembly of electronic goods. So over time, you see this shift where countries start off doing particular tasks and then shift into different parts of the value chain. Now, we also see a deepening of the international division of labour. And again, it's much more detailed than the type of division of labour that we are probably used to talking about. At least when I was a student, we talked about skilled and unskilled labour. Those were the two categories. Now we tend to talk much more about occupations. So we're thinking much more about really detailed classifications, engineering, research, assembly, these sort of tasks. Again, it comes from the first point about trading in tasks. Then, of course, the objective is quite different. The objective is not really to develop a full supply chain for automobiles or computers or cell phones. The objective is to join a value chain at a particular point that makes sense from the point of view of comparative advantage, and then to gradually move up over time to higher value-added activities within that same value chain. Now, the final point that I think is really different and is worth thinking about is the role of services. In the first unbundling, when people talked about services, it was really transport services. So that was kind of the key input into the trading process. If you think of the complexity of production within a global value chain, there's actually a huge requirement for services to make that value chain work. Logistics are a good example. So that's a type of service that makes it possible to coordinate all of the deliveries and the movements of goods that have to take place within a global value chain. Transport, of course, is still important, but we also see business services, we see finance, we see all of these other dimensions of services, professional services, playing into the production process in different ways. Then at the same time, I think another factor that's quite different is that the rise of ICTs is affecting the way in which services themselves are traded. We're seeing the rise of value chains in services themselves. So if we think of a sector like finance, this is one that is now seeing the rise of regional and global value chains. It's effectively going through both unbundlings more or less simultaneously. So let's look in a little more detail about a few supply chains, a few global value chains. Here's one that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. This is Apple. Of course, it's a US company. The point I want to make, when you look at the left-hand chart, it just amazes me how international the Apple value chain is. Nearly 350 suppliers in China alone, another 140 in Japan, 60 in the United States, 42 in Taiwan, China, 32 in South Korea. And then if you look on the right-hand panel, you can see these different functions, and you can start to get a sense of how the different tasks within the value chain are placed in different countries according to their comparative advantage as narrowly defined. So if you think of the complexity that goes into this, I think you can see the role of the lead firm in coordinating the whole thing, and again, the role of services in making all of this possible. Now, of course, Apple is a high technology company, and I think often when we talk about value chains, there's this assumption that it's for high-tech products. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Here's an example of Uniqlo's value chain. Uniqlo, of course, a Japanese company present all over the world, an apparel company, in case you're not familiar with it. And you can see on the left-hand panel that they source goods from all over Asia. So it's more of a regional focus than a supply chain like Apple's. But then again, on the right-hand side, you can see that even in a sector like apparel, which is relatively low technology, there's still this division of the production process into a series of tasks which can then be split across different countries according to their pattern of comparative advantage. So again, fitting pretty classically within the value chain framework. Value chains are even important in agriculture. Here's a value chain for Nutella. In case you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty delicious hazelnut spread. You can see that the headquarters there is in Italy, but the supply chain, again, is global. If you look at the green circles, those are the main international suppliers. The red triangles are factories. And you can see that these are geographically dispersed really all over the place, all over different world regions. So even for a food product like Nutella, again, not particularly high technology, the value chain model is absolutely relevant. One last example, I like to talk about services. I won't go into any great detail about this, but this comes from a study of the banking and finance global value chain. And the beauty of this diagram is that I think, again, it gives us a really nice sense of how even a service like finance can be split up into all of these different tasks, which you can then potentially do in different places. To give an example from where I'm from, New York City, we have businesses like Goldman Sachs here. It's a huge investment bank. They've invested heavily in India. And so a number of their functions, particularly back office, accounting, all of these sorts of things, but increasingly also financial activities, research, are coordinated across the two locations. So basically when Manhattan is going to bed, Bangalore is waking up. And so there is this possibility to effectively do a certain amount of work on a task in Manhattan, then turn it over to the staff in India. They work on it during their day, and it comes back when the staff in Manhattan come to the office the next morning. So this sort of coordination we're increasingly seeing in services value chains. So if that's our framework, if we're thinking about the value chain development model as kind of a new paradigm for development policy and trade policy, then from a policy perspective, we become really interested in knowing the origin of value added in particular goods and sectors. So what do I mean by that? Well, we want to distinguish two things. We want to distinguish value added that is supplied by producers located within the exporting country, that is to say domestic value added, from foreign value added, which is value added supplied by producers located outside the country of export. So let me explain what I mean by that. It might not be immediately obvious, but foreign value added is the use of intermediate goods or services coming from other countries. That is to say that I effectively take those goods and services, I bundle them into what I'm making, and then I ship the whole thing off to its final consumer. So that sort of linkage is a classic value chain linkage, and it's referred to typically in the literature as backward linkages. We can also think about it from the reverse perspective. I'm interested in knowing what proportion of my intermediates as an export are then taken by other countries and used in the production of their exports. So you can see that's very much the mirror image of backward linkages. We typically refer to it as forward linkages. It's a component of domestic value added. We can apply these concepts equally well to goods and services. And the key insight that I'd like you to take away, and this is one that has led to real confusion in policy circles, but it seems to be the case that domestic and foreign value added are complements, not substitutes. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at an example. Here's some trade and value added data for the Thai motor vehicle sector, of course, a major export sector in Thailand. Now, look first just at the left-hand panel. Sometimes when I give a talk like this with policymakers and we talk about domestic value added and foreign value added, a hand goes up and someone says, okay, so should my objective be to maximize the proportion of domestic value added in my value chain? And my answer is a very clear no, okay? And the reason is this one. If you look at the movement from 1995 to 2011 in the Thai motor vehicle sector, you see that the proportion of domestic value added went down slightly. Okay, so if you were targeting as much in terms of proportion of domestic value added as possible, you'd consider that a failure. Now look at the right-hand side graph. That's motor vehicle exports in dollar terms. You can see that it's multiplied many, many, many times over. So this is what the OECD calls taking a smaller slice of a larger pie. Okay, the idea is that accessing some foreign value added through backward linkages, that is to say, taking the best value and best quality inputs from wherever they may be produced, enables you to grow the sector more quickly than you otherwise would. Okay, so even though the bar is slightly lower on the left-hand side, when we get to the right-hand side, we see that the sector has actually enjoyed this explosive growth. Let me show you what that looks like in Vietnam, since I've been mentioning it. Here's a sectoral breakdown. What that's showing you is the average annualized growth rate of domestic and foreign value added in these various sectors. And you can see that foreign value added is actually growing more quickly, sometimes substantially more quickly than domestic value added. But the key thing is that except for one sector, wood and paper, with a very tiny decrease, it does appear to be a complementary relationship. That is to say that higher growth in foreign value added tends to bring along higher growth in domestic value added as well. So it's a key idea. From a policy perspective, we are interested in helping the sector grow And that does not mean maximizing the proportion of domestic value added in exports. Okay, so outward orientation, what does that look like in a value chain development model? Well, the beauty of outward orientation is that we use the size of the world market to encourage economies of scale in our own market. Even very populous countries, India and China, India particularly still has a relatively small economy compared with the large developed economies and compared to the world economy as a whole. So an outward focus can be really helpful in supporting specialization within our own economy and allowing firms to realize economies of scale. Now, of course, reducing trade costs, whether from tariffs or other measures, is key. That's a very good thing to be doing. Focusing on intra-regional trade is helpful, but it shouldn't be at the expense of global trade. Okay, so things like trade creation and trade diversion are still very relevant within a value chain context. We want to make sure that when we're accessing foreign value added, we're accessing the best quality and best priced inputs that we possibly can, wherever they come from. If they come from our region, that's great. But if they don't come from our region, that's also great. We should be able to access them in order to make our final goods producers more competitive. So I do feel that the value chain development model gives us a bit of a different way of thinking about outward oriented growth strategies. And in my view, it's supporting some of what we've seen over recent years in countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh in terms of their development strategies, which have been very successful in terms of promoting not only growth in GDP, but also in per capita income, and very importantly, poverty reduction. Okay, so that's the background. That sets the scene. That gives you the model and the paradigm that we're in. Now I want to talk about measuring trade and value added. Now the question is, you know, my customs agency collects excellent trade data. Why would I want to use anything else? Okay, what's the rationale for looking at trade and value added data as opposed to the traditional trade data that we're used to? Well, let's go back to this chart. So we've got, again, Singapore, Korea, and Hong Kong, China. You'll see that in all of them, there are periods, and indeed it's the full period for two of the economies in question, where trade is greater than 100% of GDP. Now, how can that be? Okay, how can the amount that we trade be more than the amount that we produce in a year, which is what GDP is? Now, of course, you can give me one answer. You can say, well, look, trade is exports plus imports. If I write down the national accounts identity, I do exports minus imports. So that's part of the answer, but I'm going to suggest to you that it's not the full answer, and it certainly can't explain why we're seeing trade being 400% of GDP in Hong Kong, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. Let's look at a more fundamental reason, and it's the way in which trade data are recorded and the way in which the national accounts are computed. So trade is measured on a gross value or gross shipments basis. That means that when I import a product into my country, the value for customs purposes is the value that's written on the invoice, or in some cases, some kind of reference price. But basically, it's the wholesale price at the port, the CIF price. So that's the full price of the goods. Now compare that to how we calculate GDP. GDP is calculated on a value-added basis. So for everything that we're adding into the GDP equation, we're taking the invoice value and then we're subtracting out the value of all the intermediate goods and services that go into that final price. So there are two fundamentally different accounting strategies. And you can see that if we add up the invoice prices of everything we're trading and then compare it to a value-added calculation, we can easily get over 100%. So there's this fundamental incompatibility between customs data and the data in national accounts. Now, value chains put another twist on this and make the whole point much more important than it was historically. Let's take a really simple example. I've got two countries. I've very imaginatively called them A, B, and C. Now, here's the economic nature of the transaction. Countries A and B together add 50 units of value added to a particular good, which is then shipped off to country C and sold for 100 currency units. So from an economic perspective, if we think of the economic nature of the transactions, we've got a total amount of trade, that is to say an economic value of trade of 100 units. Now let's see what that looks like if we consider traditional trade data. Now, if A and B are both involved in the production process, one country has to ship their stuff to the other country before production can be completed. So let's say the production involves an input coming from B. So country B adds its 50 units of value added, and then it ships its good or service off to country A. That is then recorded as an import in country A of 50 units, okay, and an export from country B, similarly of 50 units. Country A then adds its 50 units of value added, and it ships the goods off to country C, where it's recorded as an export from A, an import to C of 100 units. Now, if we add up total global trade in that scenario, it comes to 150. Okay, so you can see, even in this very simple example, that the economic nature of the transactions, which I described on the first slide, where we've got a total movement of economic value of 100 units, is actually very different from what we see in trade data, where it's telling us that there are 150 units moving. So I've explained all of this in the slide here. Now, the point that I want you to take away, I described a very simple value chain. Imagine that in multiple sectors, numerous countries, and goods moving back and forth multiple times during production in a complex way. You can quickly see that when we've got a significant role for regional and global value chains in the global economy, we get this disconnect between the economic nature of the transactions that are taking place and what we're seeing in trade statistics that are recorded by customs. And I should say, I'm talking about customs. If you go to UN Comtrade or any of the other databases, WITS, these sorts of things, you're getting data that has come from customs. So we get this fundamental disconnect between the two ways of measuring value. Let's talk about a concrete example to see how serious the issue is. I'm taking the iPhone as an example because there's a really nice study that actually breaks down the value-added origin of the iPhone. Now, the gross value of the iPhone, this is old data, so these figures will have changed. But at the time that this was written, when you exported an iPhone, it's assembled in China. So for trade purposes, it's considered made in China. You ship it from China to the USA. The import price into the USA is a bit under $250. So that's the left-hand bar, and that's what comes out of customs, is just that single bar telling you this is a Chinese product, comes into the US valued $250. Now, if we look at the right-hand panel, this is the value-added breakdown by origin of those $250. Now, look at the light blue shading. That's China. You can see that it's only a small fraction of those $250. The largest fraction is actually from the United States itself. Okay, how does that work? Well, that's the design services, the intellectual property that's going into the iPhone. China is assembling it. Okay, that's where their value added comes from. But the United States is supplying a lot of the intellectual property and some of the services content that goes into the iPhone. The red bar shows you Japan. What's Japan supplying? Different sorts of high technology inputs, also some services inputs. Then we see similarly Taiwan, China, and Korea supplying substantial proportions of the final value of the good. So this gives you an idea of just how different it can be to map the economic nature of the transactions, which is the right-hand panel, versus what customs tells us on the left-hand panel. When we've got a complex value chain, there can really be very little connection between those two things. So the concept of trade and value added allows us to break down the data that we get from customs that are in gross shipments terms and to figure out those value added components. It's a close analogy with what the author did there for the iPhone to actually get those bits of value. And you know, you can imagine doing it product by product. I'm talking to Apple and all these other guys. Of course, what we're trying to do is a more systematic approach where we break all of this down by country and by sector, okay? Preferably using data that we can easily get our hands on. So from a policy perspective, what's the consequence of this? Obviously, it helps us understand the world economy a lot better and the nature of the value that is exchanged within the world economy. But it also changes something that's of great political significance, and that is something like the bilateral trade balance. It's a big issue in my country, the United States, the bilateral balance with China. I'm showing you here the difference between the bilateral balance measured in gross shipments terms and the bilateral balance measured in value-added terms. You can see that measuring it in value-added terms reduces the size of the US deficit by about 1/3. Okay, so that's massively important from a policy perspective. And the reason is the one that you saw on the iPhone graph, that a lot of the stuff coming into the US from China actually has substantial US content. The content is often invisible. It can be services and intellectual property, but it's still there as a matter of economic value. Now, of course, I don't want to take away from this that I, as an economist, care even a little bit about the bilateral deficit that the US runs with China. I think it's completely irrelevant to both of those economies. I'm citing it because it's got tremendous political importance and therefore a certain amount of policy importance. So just to tell you that the way that you account for these transactions can make a really big difference to the way that you see important policy questions. Okay, so as I said, the way that this was done in the iPhone example is very intuitive. You basically go and ask Apple where they get their stuff from. You can't do that for every good in the universe and every service in the universe. You need some more sort of systematic approach. And of course, you need to do multiple stages of production. So it's not just enough to get kind of one round of input using the iPhone. You need to go to all the input producers and ask them where they get their inputs from. Okay, so we have this long chain of input use that we need to try and fully account for. And in the next session, I'll show you how we can mobilize some math to try and do that in a very systematic way. But what I want to do now is just to talk intuitively about the sort of data that we would use for that. I'm not going to go into great detail because we will have a presentation from the experts at ADB talking about their multi-region input-output table they put together with their partners. But basically, we need a few different components. First, obviously, we need bilateral trade data. In gross shipments terms, we need to cover goods and services. Then we need an input-output table. And an input-output table really just tells us for each sector in the economy how much stuff it uses from other sectors in the economy. And then, of course, how much of its output goes into final demand. Now, it's got to be an input-output table with a bit of a difference. These things always cover goods and services, that's standard, but we need them to cover all of the countries that we're interested in as well. So we're really talking about a multi-region input-output table. Now, just thinking about where we would get these sorts of data, as you know, bilateral trade data in goods, they're easy to access. Customs collect those all around the world. They report them to the UN, goes into Comtrade, accessible through WITS, et cetera, et cetera. It's all got to be harmonized, put into a sectoral classification that can work with the input-output table. That is not a particularly easy thing to do, but it's a problem that we can solve with concordances. There are other issues that we have to address, such as balancing reported exports and reported imports. But basically, this is something that we can imagine doing for goods. For services, it's much harder. Many countries around the world simply don't collect bilateral trade and services data. This is true even for some of the larger developing economies. It tends to be only the higher income economies that collect fully disaggregated trade and services data. So there needs to be some modeling and estimation. This is where statisticians work their magic to try and fill in a bilateral trade and services matrix. Again, not a simple thing to do, but there are established techniques with which statisticians can do this. So the multi-region input-output table poses a number of challenges. And again, the experts from ADB will go into this in more detail. A basic input-output table, we know what it does. It relates final demand, gross output, value added, and input use. We can get all of those things from one beautiful table. Now, most countries around the world have an input-output table. The issue is how detailed it is and how frequently it is updated. The larger, higher income economies tend to update their table pretty frequently. Smaller, lower income economies tend to do it much less frequently. So that's an issue. There can again be the need to impute some data to model and estimate some data if we're doing a base year in the multi-region input-output table for which there is no actual collected input-output table for a particular country. Again, a bit of the trick then comes in how we deal with imports and exports in a multi-region input-output table. The experts from ADB, I think, will have more to say about that. But a national input-output table typically doesn't give exports and imports by destination and origin. So that's something that we need to do using a modelling assumption. It's called the proportionality assumption, is the typical way of doing it. And that's simply a way of allocating trade data across sectors and countries so that we get a full disaggregation within this matrix. So there are some sort of nuts and bolts of how we go about collecting an input-output table, where it comes from. Essentially, it comes originally from a survey that we do. National statistics agencies are pretty experienced in putting these sorts of tables together. I think it is important to have an idea of where the data come from, and the ADB experts will speak to that in a bit more detail. For present purposes, I think we really just want to recognise how complex the process is to take all of these national input-output tables, trade data, and put them all together into a multi-region input-output table. Okay, of course, we need to be aware, given that there's a lot of modelling and estimation that's going into the multi-region input-output table, we always need to be careful when we use it. So a standard caveat in this sort of work is that data is not always observed for all countries and all years. I do believe that these tools are the best available. So the one that we're going to be working with, which is assembled by ADB and its partners, is based on really excellent statistical work. It's a high quality multi-region input-output table. So we can be confident that it represents the best available data, but best available is not the same as perfect. So we always need to be aware of that when we're doing empirical work. So in terms of sources, there are basically four of them that people turn to. None of us in this room is going to be sitting down and putting together our own multi-region input-output table. It's a hugely complex, very time-consuming endeavour. And there are four sources that people commonly use. There's the Trade and Value-Added data set of OECD, WTO. There's the World Input-Output Database. There's EORA. And there's the multi-region input-output table from ADB and its partners. That's the one that we're going to be looking at. It covers 73 countries and 35 sectors, data for 2007, 2011, 2017. Now, what I like about both this table and its counterpart that is just for Asia is the very recent nature of the data. So the combined data set goes to 2017. The one for Asia and its partners goes to 2019. So this is really fantastic work by ADB. None of the other sources go much past 2015. So it is really very helpful to have this more recent data. The other thing that I think is fantastic about the ADB data set, and this is both the 73 country version and the 63 country version, is that they have already prepared some very detailed indicators on global value chain integration. So we're going to be talking about what those indicators are and how we use them in the next two lectures. But ADB has actually done the fairly annoying part of it, which is to run some pretty detailed computer code to produce these indicators. It's an Excel sheet. You can then take it and use it. As long as you understand what each of these things is saying, you can very quickly produce high quality research using these data. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first lecture. As I said, it's a bit of a bird's eye view, both of the value chain development model, trade and value added, and where we would start in terms of thinking about producing systematic data on trade and value added. I put the takeaway slides up again. I hope everyone can walk away with these points clear. I think the main thing for me is understanding that in a value chain world, customs trade data no longer tell the full story of the economic transactions that go into exports and imports. We need to work a lot harder to get an idea of how the value is moving behind those transactions. That's what we're trying to do with trade and value added, and it's what we'll be talking about in more detail in the next 2 lectures.